The galaxy had rules. Every civilization that had reached the stars knew them. The Galactic Conclave, a council of 47 alien species, had written those rules over thousands of years of war, negotiation, blood, and silence. They were carved into quantum stone tablets on the neutral station of Varith Prime. They were broadcast in 212 languages across every inhabited star system. Every ambassador, every admiral, and every child born on a space station learned these skills before they learned how to walk in zero gravity. Rule 1. No fleet shall cross into sovereign space without declaration. Rule 2. No weapon shall be fired within a neutral corridor. Rule 3. No species shall be harvested, enslaved, or exterminated. Humanity had agreed to all three rules the day they joined the Conclave, 22 years ago in the Earth year 2271. The Valorians had agreed to these terms 400 years earlier. And yet here they were. The Valorian Armada, 116 warships strong, crossed the human border at 0300 hours, Deep Space Standard Time. They did not send a declaration. They did not signal a warning. They did not even bother to jam human communications because, as Admiral Croth of the Valorian High Command had said in his private briefing the night before, humans are too slow to respond anyway. He had laughed when he said it. His officers had laughed with him. None of them were laughing now. Because what Admiral Croth did not know, what the entire Valorian High Command had somehow failed to understand in all their centuries of galactic dominance, was a single critical piece of information about humanity that every other species in the Conclave had quietly learned the hard way. Humans do not sleep all at the same time. Somewhere on Earth, it is always daytime. Somewhere in the human frontier, that sprawling network of colonies, stations, and deep space outposts stretching across 6 star systems. Someone is always awake, always watching, always with their finger resting just close enough to a button that it matters. On the outer edge of the Callaway system, a 23-year-old sensor operator named Danny Reeves was eating a cold sandwich and watching his screens with the specific, focused boredom of someone who had been on the night shift for 11 days straight. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago. His replacement was still 4 hours away. The station was quiet, the stars were still, and Danny Reeves had absolutely nothing to do. Until he did. The proximity alarm didn't scream. It didn't flash red or blare a horn like in the old war movies his grandfather used to watch. It just blinked. A soft, amber pulse on the lower left corner of his screen. A single, quiet notification, the kind that most operators might glance at and dismiss as a calibration ghost, a sensor hiccup, or a piece of debris drifting too close to the line. Danny Reeves did not dismiss it. He sat up straight, put down his sandwich, and leaned toward his screen with the expression of a man who had just heard something move in a dark room. He ran the scan twice. Then he opened a channel directly to Commander Rita Vasquez at Central Fleet Command, 4 light minutes away. "Commander," he said, his voice completely calm, "I have 116 Valorian warships inside the Callaway border. No declaration. No signal. They are moving at attack formation speed, bearing directly toward Callaway Station." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Commander Vasquez then uttered 4 words that would later appear in every military history book written about this day. "How long do we have?" Danny checked his calculations. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 40 minutes, Commander. Maybe 42. Another pause. Shorter this time. "That's enough," said Commander Vasquez. And it was. There is something that the Valorians, and indeed most species in the Galactic Conclave, fundamentally misunderstood about humanity. It was not their weapons. Humanity's weapons were adequate but not exceptional by galactic standards. The Drath had better cannons. The Solarians had faster missiles. The Corvette had shielding technology so advanced it made human defense systems look like tin foil wrapped around a cardboard box. It was not their ships. Human ships were sturdy and well-built, but they were not the most elegant or the most powerful in the Conclave. Most alien admirals, when reviewing human fleet specs, gave a polite nod and silently ranked them somewhere in the middle of the pack. It was not even their numbers. Humanity had a respectable fleet, 300 active warships, 47 defense platforms, and enough armed patrol vessels to make a pirate think twice, but it was not an overwhelming force by any serious military calculation. No. What made humanity dangerous, what made them uniquely, terrifyingly dangerous, was something far simpler than weapons, ships, or numbers. It was their speed. Not the speed of their ships. The speed of their decisions. 40 minutes after Danny Reeves made his call, Commander Rita Vasquez had already done the following. She had woken up. Admiral James Harrow, the leader of the Frontier Fleet, had sent an urgent message to all 17 armed ships nearby, She had put Callaway Station on full military lockdown, moving all 12,000 civilians into the deep core shelters that had been practiced for every 6 months. She had filed an official emergency complaint with the Galactic Conclave's Emergency Tribunal, time-stamped, documented, and shared on the open diplomatic channel so that everyone in the galaxy could see what was happening and who was responsible. And she had gathered all the information the Human Frontier Defense Agency had ever collected on Valorian fleet tactics, formation patterns, and known weaknesses. She had done all of this before Admiral Crotha's fleet had even reached the midpoint of their crossing. Admiral Harrow was already dressed and in the command chair when she patched him in. He was 61 years old, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, with a face that had the permanent expression of a man who had been unimpressed by things that should have impressed him and completely calm about things that should have terrified him. He had served in the Frontier Fleet for 39 years. He had been involved in 3 border conflicts, 2 formal military engagements, and 1 event that was simply referred to in classified files as the Terrath Incident, and never discussed in polite company. He looked at the display showing 116 Valorian warships moving through human space and said, "How long?" 29 minutes now, Admiral. He nodded slowly. What have we got in range? 17 patrol vessels, 4 of which are fully armed. The Meridian and the Stonewall are both within sprint distance. The defense platforms covering the station are online and hot. What about the Kestrel group? Commander Vasquez allowed herself a minimal, very quiet smile. Already moving, Admiral. They were running drills in the Tessian belt. They pivoted the moment I transmitted the alert. Estimated arrival, 24 minutes. Admiral Harrow looked at the screen again. 116 Valorian warships. Moving in a tight, arrogant formation that said, very clearly, we are not expecting a fight. He folded his hands on the table. Good, he said. Then they'll arrive before the Valorians do. Aboard the lead Valorian warship, the Dominion of Croth, Admiral Croth was eating his evening meal and reviewing the final approach calculations when his sensor officer, a young Valorian named Sethric, turned from his station with an expression that Croth had never seen on one of his officers before. It was, Admiral Croth would later realize, the expression of someone who has just understood that they have made a grave mistake. Admiral, said Sethric, I am detecting movement. What kind of movement? Sethric stared at his screen. His secondary eyes, the smaller pair above his primary ones which Valorians used for threat assessment, had gone very wide. Human ships, Admiral. Coming from 3 different directions, they are already in formation. Croth set down his fork. How many? Sethric was quiet for a moment that lasted far too long. Enough, he said. Admiral Croth did not panic. He was a Valorian admiral, and Valorian admirals did not panic. It was, technically speaking, biologically difficult. Valorians had a secondary nervous system specifically designed to suppress the kind of sudden emotional flooding that lesser species called panic. They were built for composure in crisis. It was one of the things they were most proud of. But Admiral Croth did do something that, for a Valorian admiral, was nearly as unusual as panic. He hesitated. He stared at Sethric's screen. He looked at the human ships assembling in front of him, behind him, and on his flanks, all of them moving with a speed and coordination that made no tactical sense unless they had been warned long before they should have been able to be warned. He looked at the formation his own fleet was in, aggressive, tight, built for forward attack and terrible for a multidirectional defense engagement. And he thought cautiously about how he had gotten here. The mission, as he had understood it, was simple. The Valorian High Command saw the Callaway system as a place full of resources that they believed humanity couldn't defend well and wasn't important enough in the Conclave to be helped. The plan was to cross the border, overwhelm the station, claim a medical emergency as legal cover, a well-used Valorian diplomatic trick that had worked 4 times before with 4 other species, and establish a Valorian administrative presence before anyone could formally object. Clean, fast, profitable. That was the plan. The plan had not accounted for Danny Reeves eating a cold sandwich at 0300 hours. Croth straightened in his chair. Open a channel to the human fleet commander. His communications officer, Dreth, looked at him with an expression that clearly communicated surprise at this choice. Sir? We are still within range to push forward and... Open the channel, Dreth. The channel opened. There was a brief hum of carrier signal, and then a human face appeared on Crotha's screen. It was not the face he had expected. He had expected someone angry. Valorians tended toward fury in these situations. Bared teeth, raised crests, voices pitched at the frequency designed to project dominance. He had expected the human to scream at him, issue wild threats, and perhaps even cry. Admiral James Harrow did none of these things. He sat in his command chair with his hands folded on the table in front of him, and he looked at Admiral Croth with the patient, unhurried expression of a man who had been waiting for someone to arrive and was mildly pleased that they had finally shown up. "Admiral Croth," said Harrow, "I know who you are. I've read your service record. You're a capable officer, and I don't think you're a stupid man." He paused. "So I'm going to speak to you the way I'd speak to someone who is not stupid." Another pause. "You are currently inside human sovereign space with 116 warships. You have filed no declaration. You have sent no signal. Under Conclave Rule 1, you are in open violation of galactic law, and I have already transmitted documentation of that violation to the Emergency Tribunal, where it has been received and time-stamped by representatives of 31 species." Harrow glanced briefly at something off-screen, then back. "You are surrounded. Not by a lot. I want to be honest with you about that because I think you deserve honesty right now. But you are surrounded, and the ships you are surrounded by are fully armed, fully crewed, and their commanders have already received their engagement orders." He leaned forward slightly. "Here is what I am offering you, Admiral. Turn your fleet around. Leave human space the way you came in. File whatever story you want with the Conclave. Engine trouble, navigational error, I genuinely do not care. Leave our space and I will not fire a single shot today." He leaned back again. "But if you continue forward, toward that station, toward our people, toward our home, then I promise you, Admiral Croth, that by the time your high command realizes what has happened, humans will have already struck again. And again. And again. Until there is nothing left of this armada but a debris field and a very uncomfortable diplomatic conversation." Complete silence on the channel. Croth stared at the human admiral. Harrow stared back. "You have 4 minutes to decide," said Harrow. "After that, my patience and my orders diverge, and I will no longer be in a position to offer you anything." The channel stayed open. The silence stretched. On every human ship in that formation, 12,000 sailors sat at battle stations, fingers resting on controls, eyes on screens, breathing slow and steady and ready. Croth looked at Sethric. Sethric looked at his screen and said nothing. The number of human ships had not changed. The formation had not changed. The patience of Admiral Harrow had not changed. The 4 minutes passed like years. "Caro," Croth said quietly, it was a word borrowed from an old Valorian battlefield prayer, meaning enough, we stop here. He straightened in his chair. "Helm. Reverse course. All ships." The Galactic Conclave Emergency Tribunal convened 14 hours after the Valorian Armada turned around. It was, by most accounts, one of the most unusual sessions in the Tribunal's 800-year history, not because of the legal arguments made or the evidence presented, or even the scale of the violation itself, which was significant but not unprecedented. It was unusual because of the mood in the chamber. Every one of the 31 species whose representatives had received Commander Vasquez's time-stamped emergency transmission had watched the entire encounter unfold in real time on the open diplomatic channel. They had watched the Valorian fleet cross the border. They had watched human ships materialize from 3 directions in under 40 minutes. They had listened to Admiral Harrow's 4-minute offer. They had watched Admiral Croth turn his fleet around. And now they were all sitting in the tribunal chamber, and the atmosphere was one that the Conclave's senior translator, a 400-year-old Sirathi named Oaleth who had attended more diplomatic sessions than any other living being in the galaxy, later described in her personal records as electric. Not angry. Not frightened. Something else entirely. Something I have not felt in this chamber in a very long time. The word Oaleth was looking for, though she did not know the human language well enough to use it, was impressed. The Valorian ambassador, a silver carapaced diplomat named Veth, stood at the center of the chamber and delivered the standard Valorian explanation. Navigational error, sensor malfunction, immediate course correction upon discovery of the mistake. It was smooth. It was well rehearsed. It was the same explanation, almost word for word, that Valorian ambassadors had given 4 times before in 4 different border violations with 4 different species. The difference this time was that the tribunal did not accept it. Not because the explanation was any worse than before, but because this time, the species sitting in judgment had just watched a live demonstration of something that changed the entire calculation. Ambassador Thal of the Drath, a hulking, 6-limbed species who had the second most powerful military in the Conclave and had been quietly wary of Valorian expansion for 2 centuries, was the first to speak after Veth finished. He rose from his seat with the slow deliberateness of someone who is choosing their words very carefully. "I have a question," said Ambassador Thal, "not for the Valorian delegation. For the human delegation." There was a murmur in the chamber. This was unusual. The human delegation, Ambassador Sarah Chin, a 44-year-old woman with short black hair and the precise, watchful composure of someone who had spent 20 years in difficult rooms, looked up from her notes and nodded. "Please," she said. "In 40 minutes, said Thal, your people assembled a defensive formation capable of surrounding a fleet of 116 warships. From a standing start. In the middle of the night cycle." He paused. "Is that normal for you?" Ambassador Chen considered the question for a moment with an expression that suggested she was deciding how much honesty was appropriate. "It was within our standard emergency response parameters," she said carefully. Another murmur in the chamber. Several representatives leaned toward each other and began speaking in low voices. Ambassador Thal sat down slowly, still looking at Sarah Chen with the expression of someone who has just realized that the quiet neighbor they have never paid much attention to has been, this whole time, quietly building something remarkable in their backyard. The Valorian representative Veth, who had expected this session to end with a modest fine and a stern diplomatic note, looked around the chamber and realized, with a slow, creeping horror, that the room had changed around him without him noticing. The other species were not looking at the Valorians. They were looking at the humans. Not with fear. With recalculation. Every alliance. Every treaty. Every quiet diplomatic assumption about where humanity sat in the galactic pecking order, all of it was being silently, rapidly revised in real time, right in front of him, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. The fine the tribunal issued to the Valorian Empire that day was the largest in Conclave history. It was not the fine that changed the situation. 3 weeks after the tribunal session, Admiral Harrow received an unexpected visitor at Frontier Fleet Command. Her name was Thessaly, Ambassador Thessaly, formally speaking, representing the Corveth Confederacy, a species that occupied 7 star systems in the outer spiral and had spent the last 2 centuries maintaining a cautious, very calculated neutrality in all conclave matters. The Corveth were known for 3 things: extraordinary shielding technology, a complete unwillingness to take sides, and a level of strategic patience that other species sometimes mistook for indifference. Harrow received her in his office. A plain, functional room with one wide viewport looking out at the stars and a desk that had more files on it than any desk had a right to have. He offered her the kind of simple hospitality that the Corveth actually preferred: still water, a quiet room, and no performance. Thessaly was tall and pale blue, with elongated fingers and eyes that were entirely silver. She sat across from Harrow and looked at him for a long time before she said anything. "I watched the incident in the Callaway system," she said. "Most people did," said Harrow. "I watched it more carefully than most," she said. "I watched it 4 times. I had our strategic analysts watch it. I had our fleet admirals watch the video. And then I came here because I wanted to ask you something directly, Admiral, rather than through the usual channels where everything gets polished and softened before it arrives." "I appreciate that," said Harrow. "Go ahead." "The speed," she said. The decision speed was 40 minutes from first detection to full defensive formation. How was this result achieved? Harrow looked at her for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "Training. All species train." "Not like this," he said. "We run emergency drills every 6 months on every station, every ship, and every outpost in the frontier. The drills include a comprehensive scenario, a comprehensive response, and real-time coordination. Not theoretical. Not simulated. Actual emergency condition drills where every person, from a 23-year-old sensor operator eating a sandwich at 0300 hours to a fleet admiral woken up in the middle of the night, knows exactly what they are supposed to do and does not have to wait for someone above them to tell them." Thessaly was quiet. "You trust the 23-year-old?" she asked. "More than anything," said Harrow. "Because I trained him. He has a thorough understanding of the plan just as I do. Because he knows that if he sees something and doesn't call it in, people die, and he doesn't want people to die. That's not strategy, Ambassador. That's culture." Thessaly sat with that for a long moment. "We have better shields than you," she said. "I know," said Harrow. "We have faster ships. I know that too. But you responded in 40 minutes, she said, and there was something in her silver eyes that was neither quite admiration nor quite envy but lived somewhere close to both. "And we would have taken 4 hours. At minimum." She stood up and Harrow stood with her. "I came to ask you something, Admiral," she said. "The Corveth Confederacy has been neutral for 200 years. We have been careful. We have been safe. And we have watched species like the Valorians grow bolder every decade because there is never a consequence fast enough to matter." She looked at him directly. Would humanity be interested in a training partnership? Harrow looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Let me make a call." He called Commander Vasquez. He called Ambassador Chin. He called 3 members of the Earth Defense Council. All of these calls happened within 20 minutes, and every one of them ended with the same answer. He turned back to Thessaly. "Yes," he said. "We would." It was the beginning of something that no one in the Valorian High Command would fully understand until it was far too late. Back on Valorian Prime, in the deep chamber of the High Command where decisions were made that the rest of the galaxy was never supposed to find out about, there was a meeting. It was not a comfortable meeting. Admiral Croth stood at the center of the chamber and delivered his report on the Callaway incident with the precise, factual tone of a man who has accepted that he is not going to enjoy the next several hours. He did not embellish. He did not minimize. He laid out exactly what had happened, in order, without apology. The High Command listened in silence. High Commander Sareth, the most powerful Valorian alive, sat at the head of the table, cold-eyed and brilliant from centuries of political survival, and listened to every word. When Croth finished, Sareth was quiet for a long time. "The fine," he said finally, "is manageable." "Yes, High Commander." "The diplomatic setback," he said, "is temporary." "Yes, High Commander." "The intelligence failure," he said, and here his voice changed slightly, the way the temperature of a room changes slightly when someone opens a window in winter, "is not manageable. It is not temporary. And it is not acceptable." He looked around the table. We had complete files on humanity's fleet. We had sensor logs, patrol schedules, ship specifications, and crew numbers. We had 40 years of observation data. And somehow, in all of that data, we missed the single most important fact about how they operate. He paused. "Who can tell me what that fact is?" Silence around the table. Then a young intelligence officer named Vares, who had been sitting at the far end and had been hoping very much not to be noticed, said quietly, "They trust their lowest ranks, High Commander." A junior sensor operator made the call that triggered the entire response. He didn't wait for authorization. He just called it in. Sareth looked at Vares for a long moment. "Correct," he said. "And why did we miss that?" Vares hesitated. "Because we were looking at their ships, sir. Their weapons. Their numbers. We were measuring the things we measure when we look at other species. And we did not think to measure," said Sareth, "the things that make humans different from every other species we have ever encountered." He stood up from the table. Slowly, the way very old, very powerful people stand when they want the room to feel the weight of the movement. "Pull every intelligence file we have on human civilian culture. Their education systems. Their military training protocols. Their colony emergency procedures. Their decision-making architecture at every level of society." He looked at Vares. "You lead the review. I want a complete analysis in 30 days. "Yes, High Commander." "And someone," said Sareth quietly, "find out what the Corvette ambassador was doing at Frontier Fleet Command last week." The room went very still. "Because if humanity and the Corvette are talking," said Sareth, "then we have a problem that is significantly larger than a diplomatic fine." He walked toward the door. He stopped without turning around. "Caro," he said softly, "we stop underestimating them. Starting now." While the Valorian High Command scrambled to understand what they had missed, something else was happening in the quieter corners of the galaxy. The species that had not made noise about the Callaway incident were, in some ways, the most important ones. There were 11 of them, mid-tier conclave members, none of them military powers, all of them occupying the kind of political space where survival meant being careful, being polite, and never drawing the attention of the species that were large enough to cause problems. They had watched the Callaway incident the same way they watched most things. Quietly, from a distance, with the patient, calculating attention of people who have spent a long time learning which way the wind is blowing before they decide which direction to walk. And what they had seen had changed something for them. The oldest of these quiet species was the Lethani, thin, slow-moving, amber-skinned beings who communicated primarily through color shifts in their skin and had the longest collective memory of any species in the conclave, having never once in their history deleted a record or forgotten a treaty. They had been members of the conclave for over 2,000 years. They had watched species rise and fall, alliances form and shatter, and wars begin in a single moment of arrogance and end decades later in exhaustion and grief. They remembered the Valori before the Valorians became what they were now. They remembered when the Valorian Empire was still small enough to be reasonable. They remembered the 4 times the standard diplomatic explanation of navigational error had been accepted, and they remembered what had happened in each of those 4 cases in the years that followed. Expansion. Precedent. More violations. More excuses. The Lethani's senior diplomat, an ancient being named Salith who was so old that parts of her skin had stopped changing colors and remained a permanent, quiet gold, sent a private message to Ambassador Sarah Chin the day after the tribunal session. It was, by Lethani standards, extremely direct. It said, "We remember everything. And we have been waiting for someone to be fast enough to matter. We are glad you were." Chin read the message 3 times. Then she sent back a single line. "We will always be fast enough. That is the one promise humanity can keep." Salith shared the response with the other 10 quiet species. She shared it without comment because in Lethani culture, the best endorsements are the ones you let speak entirely for themselves. Within 2 weeks, 6 of the 11 quiet species had sent informal diplomatic inquiries to the human embassy on Varith Prime. Not about alliances, those were too formal, too visible, and too quickly noticed. Just questions. Friendly, careful, exploratory questions about humanity's emergency response systems. About their training protocols. About whether human military advisors were ever made available to partner stations. Each inquiry was answered personally by Ambassador Chin in plain language, with the kind of practical warmth that most galactic diplomacy had entirely forgotten was possible. None of this was visible to the Valorian intelligence network. None of it was supposed to be. Meanwhile, at Callaway Station, life had returned to something close to normal. The 12,000 civilians who had sheltered in the deep core bunkers had come back to their homes, their shops, and their schools. Parents who had held their terrified children in the dark greeted them with long embraces and few words. The station's chief administrator, a broad, steady man named Mac Torres, had walked every corridor of the station in the 48 hours after the incident with the careful, hands-on attention of someone who believes that the best leadership sometimes looks like just showing up and being visible. Danny Reeves, the 23-year-old sensor operator who had started everything, had been given 3 days of mandatory rest leave and a formal commendation that he was mildly embarrassed by. He spent most of his leave calling his mother on Earth, who cried more than he did about the whole thing, and eating food from the station's cafeteria, which was considerably better than his cold sandwiches on the night shift. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had done the obvious thing at the obvious time, which was, he thought, probably how most heroes felt. He went back to work on the 4th day, sat down at his station, poured himself a cup of coffee and got back to watching the stars. He was, once again, the first line. And he knew it. 30 days after High Commander Saratha's order, the young intelligence officer Varis delivered his report. He stood before the High Command in the same deep chamber, with the same cold lighting and the same heavy silence, and he presented 47 pages of analysis with the precise, almost apologetic tone of someone delivering news that everyone in the room is going to find deeply uncomfortable. The report was called, internally, the recalibration. It covered human decision-making architecture from the ground up. The way human children were educated to question, to think independently, and to value individual judgment alongside collective responsibility. The way human military training was built was not on obedience alone, but on something harder to define and much harder to counter, what the human literature called initiative. The understanding drilled into every human soldier and officer from their first day of service, that waiting for orders when action was needed was itself a form of failure. It covered the colony networks. Human outposts were connected by rapid response communication chains with built-in redundancies, ensuring that even if the primary channel was jammed, someone on a secondary line was already making calls. It covered the culture. The human tendency to work in crisis, not despite pressure but almost better because of it. The historical record of human civilizations going back centuries shows the same pattern repeated endlessly. Resource scarcity, external threat, and internal conflict, and out of all of it, adaptation. Always adaptation. The report concluded with a section titled, Assessment, which Varis read aloud in a voice that was completely steady and cost him a tremendous deal to keep that way. Humanity is not a military superpower by conclave standards. Their fleet is mid-tier. Their weapons are adequate. Their shielding is below average. By any conventional measurement of galactic military capability, they rank 14th out of 47 species in the conclave. He paused. However, their response system, how civilian awareness, military training, diplomatic readiness, and personal action work together, makes them much stronger than what regular military measures show. In simple terms, a species that is only 14th in traditional military strength can react to an unexpected attack in 40 minutes, record the event live for everyone in the galaxy, prepare a strong diplomatic response before any fighting starts, and make the consequences of the attack so clear and obvious that the attacker backs down without firing a shot. Another pause. This situation is not a coincidence. This is infrastructure. Humanity has built, over 22 years of conclave membership, an entire system specifically optimized for exactly this kind of confrontation. They have been preparing for this scenario, or something like it, since the day they joined. He looked up from his notes. We did not see it because we were not looking for it. We were looking for the things we would build if we were in their position. We were looking for bigger ships and stronger weapons. We were looking at the wrong things. High Commander Sareth sat very still at the head of the table. The silence in the room was the specific silence of an institution that has just been told clearly and undeniably that it has made a serious, systematic, expensive mistake. There is one more thing, said Varys. Go on, said Sareth. The Corveth Training Partnership. It has been formally agreed. Human military advisors will be embedded in 6 Corveth defense stations within the next 3 months. The silence deepened. Additionally, in the last 30 days, 6 other conclave species have made diplomatic inquiries to the human embassy. Our analysis suggests that at least 3 of them are considering some form of collaborative emergency response agreement. He closed his report. High Commander. We did not just fail to take a station. We handed humanity a diplomatic opening they will use for years. From this point on, every move they make in the conclave will be built on the ground earned in the Callaway system. And we gave it to them. Sareth did not respond immediately. He looked at the table. He looked at the room. He looked at the faces of his most powerful commanders, Valorian admirals and generals and intelligence chiefs who had, until 30 days ago, been completely confident in their understanding of the galaxy they occupied. How long, he said finally, before the situation becomes something we cannot correct with conventional means? Varys hesitated. If the Corveth partnership goes ahead, and if 3 or more of the interested species make formal agreements, we think it will take about 18 months before humanity's diplomatic and military alliance becomes so large that taking direct action won't be politically acceptable. And the current timeline is? 4 months in High Commander. Sareth nodded once. Then he said something that no Valorian High Commander had said in 400 years of expansion. We need to talk to them. The request for a formal diplomatic dialogue between the Valorian Empire and the human frontier came through the Conclave's secondary diplomatic channel, the one used for conversations that both parties want to have but neither party wants the galaxy to see them initiating. Ambassador Chen received it on a Tuesday morning. She read it twice, set it on her desk and called the Earth Defense Council. The council met within 2 hours. The meeting was, in itself, a demonstration of the same principle that had defined everything about this situation. The human capacity to decide quickly when it mattered. The council's discussion lasted 6 hours, which was long by human emergency response standards but extremely fast by conclave diplomatic convention, where formal negotiations over meeting protocols alone typically took months. At the end of it they had a position. It was clear, consistent, and had been agreed to by all 17 council members, which was an outcome that surprised even the council members themselves, given that they agreed on almost nothing in normal circumstances. Ambassador Chen sent the response back through the secondary channel. The Valorians wanted a private dialogue. Humanity was willing to engage in one. However, and this was the part that, when it was later described to Admiral Harrow, made him sit back in his chair and look at Ambassador Chen with a new and specific kind of respect, humanity had conditions. The first condition was that any formal dialogue would be preceded by a full acknowledgement of the Callaway violation, on the open conclave channel, by a high command representative of senior rank. Not an ambassador. The Valorian High Command would not send a spokesman. Someone who held real power, publicly stating in plain language what had been done. The second condition was that the 12,000 civilians of Callaway Station, who had spent hours in a dark shelter believing they might die because an armada had decided their home was worth taking, would receive a direct, formal, public apology from the Valorian High Command. By name. Addressed to them specifically. The third condition was that any agreement reached in the dialogue would be made available to the Conclave's full membership within 30 days of its conclusion. The fourth condition, the one that Varys, when he read it in Sareth's briefing, would later say felt like ice water poured slowly down the back of his neck, was this. Humanity will engage in this dialogue in good faith and will bring to it a genuine desire for a stable, peaceful arrangement. However, we want to be clear. We are not afraid of the alternative. Our people are ready. Our systems are ready. Our friends, who are more numerous than they were 30 days ago, are paying close attention. If this dialogue fails, or if it is used as cover for further action against human interests, The Valorian High Command should understand that the 40 minutes in the Callaway system was not an exception. It is the standard. And the standard improves every day. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, written in the calm, even language of someone who does not need to raise their voice to make their point land. Sareth read the conditions twice. Then he said, "Acceptable," and that single word cost him more than anything he had said in years. The public acknowledgement was made 2 days later. High Commander Sareth himself stood at the conclave's central broadcast dais, the one that transmitted to every inhabited system in the known galaxy, and acknowledged in plain language that Valorian forces had crossed into human sovereign space without declaration, in violation of Conclave Rule 1. He acknowledged it without the navigational error excuse. He acknowledged it cleanly. The apology to the people of Callaway Station was read by a Valorian general standing on the steps of the Conclave building, broadcast on the same channel, and addressed by name to the 12,000 people who had sheltered in the dark. Mac Torres, watching the broadcast from his office on Callaway Station, watched the whole thing with his hands folded and his expression unreadable. When it was over, he turned to his deputy and said, "Well, that's a first." "How do you feel about it?" asked his deputy. Torres thought for a moment. "Like it's a beginning," he said. "Not an end. Never an end." The formal dialogue between the Valorian Empire and humanity took place on Vareth Prime, in a neutral conference room on the 42nd floor of the Conclave building, with a view of 3 moons and a permanent overcast sky that made the whole setting feel appropriately serious. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Chin. She brought with her 2 advisors and a legal analyst. She also brought, at the last moment, one person who was not on the official delegation list. A young woman named Lieutenant Carla Mendez, who had been the tactical coordination officer aboard the Meridian during the Callaway standoff. Chin had insisted on her presence over the objections of 2 council members who felt it was unnecessary. "She was there," Chin had said simply. "She should be here." The Valorian delegation was led by a senior diplomat named Ora, not Sareth himself, but a representative of enough rank that the gesture carried real weight. Ora was older than Veth, the ambassador who had fumbled through the tribunal session, and considerably more careful. He had reviewed every piece of available material on human negotiating history and had made a list of notes that he had burned before leaving Valorian Prime, because he did not want the risk of them being found. The dialogue lasted 4 days. On the first day they talked about what had happened. This was the most uncomfortable day. The Valorian tendency, deeply ingrained, centuries old, was to explain around blame rather than through it. Ora had to catch himself 3 times before he found the discipline to simply say we made a decision that was wrong without attaching 12 qualifications to it. On the second day they talked about what would prevent it from happening again. This was the most productive day. Humanity's proposal was specific and practical. A permanent notification protocol along the border with automatic emergency flagging on both sides. A direct communication line between Frontier Fleet Command and the Valorian High Command that bypassed normal diplomatic channels. And a joint border patrol schedule that would be filed with the Conclave monthly. The Valorians accepted all of it. On the third day they talked about the future, about the possibility of a broader relationship. This was the most surprising day. Ora, who had come prepared to negotiate limits and damages, found himself in a conversation that was moving in a direction he had not anticipated. Humanity, it turned out, was not interested in punishing the Valorian Empire. They were not interested in humiliating or weakening them, nor in using the Callaway incident as leverage to extract resources or concessions. They were interested in stability. "We are not your enemies," said Chin on the third day in the plainest possible language. "We were never trying to be your enemies. We were trying to be left alone to build something worth protecting. That's all." Ora looked at her for a long moment. "And if we had taken Callaway Station?" he asked. It was a genuine question and both of them knew it. "Then we would have taken it back," said Chin. "And everything after that would have been much harder for everyone." Ora was quiet. Then he said, "I believe you." On the 4th day they wrote the agreement. It was 12 pages long. It was clear, specific, and written in the kind of plain language that could not be explained around or reinterpreted through centuries of diplomatic tradition. Every provision had a mechanism for enforcement. Every mechanism had a monitoring process. Every monitoring process had a joint human-Valorian review board that would report its findings to the full conclave membership. Lieutenant Carla Mendez, who had said almost nothing in 4 days, signed the human copy as a witness. When Ora noticed her name on the signature line and asked who she was, Chin told him. Ora looked at Mendez for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and, in the margin next to her signature, wrote a single word in Valorian script. Mendez asked the translator what it meant. Acknowledged, said the translator. 6 months after the Callaway incident, the galaxy looked different. Not dramatically. Not in ways that appeared in official conclave announcements or showed up on the major news channels that served the 47-member species. From the outside, looking at the formal structures of galactic governance and diplomacy, most things appeared to be roughly the same. But in the smaller channels, in the secondary diplomatic lines and the informal communications and the quiet conversations between ambassadors and defense ministers and military advisors, things had shifted in ways that were real and lasting and not going away. The Corvette training partnership was 3 months into operation. 6 human military advisors were embedded in Corvette defense stations, running the same emergency drill protocols that had produced a 40-minute response time in the Callaway system. The Corvette, who had better ships and better shields than almost anyone, were finding that the human approach to preparedness was not about the ships or the shields at all. It was about the people inside them and the degree to which those people trusted their own judgment. The first time a Corvette junior officer made a command decision during a live drill without waiting for authorization from a superior, and the drill outcome improved by 40%, the Corvette fleet admiral in charge of the exercise stood very still for a moment and then said, in her native language, something that the human translator rendered as, "Oh, that's what they meant." Of the 6 species that had sent diplomatic inquiries to the human embassy, 3 had formalized collaborative emergency response agreements. The other 3 were in ongoing discussions that everyone expected to conclude positively. The Lethani, the ancient, color-shifting beings with 2,000 years of memory, had done something unprecedented. They had opened their historical records to the human diplomatic database. Not all of them. Not the most sensitive. But the ones that documented the pattern of Valorian expansion over 4 centuries, every border violation, every accepted excuse, every quiet step forward, were now part of the official human intelligence archive. You cannot counter a pattern, old Ambassador Saleth had said when she delivered the records personally, if you do not know it is a pattern. Now you know. On Callaway Station, Danny Reeves had been promoted. He was now a senior sensor analyst, responsible for training the 7 operators on his shift. His training philosophy, which he had not articulated formally but which everyone who worked with him understood intuitively, was simple. If you see something, say something. Immediately. Don't wait for it to be certain. Don't wait for someone to tell you it's okay to make the call. Make the call and let the people above you decide what to do with it. Your job is to be first. Their job is to be right. 7 trainees learned this from Danny Reeves. Each of them would go on to train others. On Valorian Prime, High Commander Sareth sat in his office and read Varys' follow-up analysis every week. The numbers of human alliances, human partnerships, and human diplomatic relationships went in one direction consistently. Sareth did not enjoy reading these reports. He read them anyway. He had changed one standing order in the High Command since the Callaway incident. Every intelligence briefing on any conclave species now ended with the same question, mandatory, to be answered by the briefing officer before the session was closed. What aspects of them are we not measuring? Varys, who gave most of these briefings, had come to believe that this question was the most important thing Sareth had done in 20 years. And on a clear night on Earth, in a quiet town in Ohio that was just warm enough for an open window, a 12-year-old girl named Maya Torres, whose Uncle Mac ran Callaway Station and who had spent a sleepless night 6 months ago listening to an emergency broadcast and not understanding all of it, sat at her desk and wrote in her journal with the focused, serious energy of someone who has decided something important. She wrote, "I want to be the one who calls it in. I want to be first." She closed the journal and looked out at the stars. 1 year after the Callaway incident, the Valorian Intelligence Network, which had been quietly, frantically rebuilding itself from the ground up under Varys' direction, produced a final summary document. It was titled, simply, Where We Stand. It was not a comfortable document. In 12 months, humanity had added 4 formal emergency response partnerships with conclave species. They had completed the first cycle of the Corvette training program, with a second cycle scheduled. They had redesigned 3 border monitoring stations using joint human-Lethani intelligence to close every gap that the original Valorian approach had exploited. They had trained 47 new senior sensor analysts across the frontier, each of them educated in the same philosophy of immediate, independent action that had made Danny Reeves the most consequential 23-year-old in recent galactic history. They had done all of this quietly, without announcement, without declaration. While the Valorian High Command was looking at their ships and their weapons and their political alliances, humanity had been building the invisible infrastructure that made their response capability, already remarkable, faster, wider, and deeper. The document's conclusion was written by Varys himself in the early hours of a morning when he had been awake for 26 consecutive hours and had long passed the point where diplomatic softening felt worth the effort. Read. The Valorian High Command entered the Callaway system believing it was crossing the border of a mid-tier species with adequate defenses and insufficient willingness to make our aggression costly. This assessment was based on conventional military metrics and was, in every meaningful way, wrong. What we encountered was not a fleet. It was a system. A civilization that has built, quietly, consistently, and with enormous patience, an architecture of preparedness that turns every individual human from a 23-year-old on a night shift to a 61-year-old admiral, into a functioning part of a response mechanism that does not sleep, does not hesitate, and does not wait. The Callaway incident was not a lucky outcome for humanity. It was a demonstration, the first public one, of what they have been building for 22 years. We moved against them because we believed they were too slow to respond. We were wrong. By the time we realized they had already responded, it was over. By the time we understood what we had done, they had already used it to build something larger. By the time we began to correct our intelligence failure, they had already struck again, not with weapons but with every treaty, every partnership, every trained sensor analyst, every emergency drill, and every quiet conversation between ambassadors in corridors where we were not watching. HFY. From this point forward, this analysis must be the foundation of every decision we make regarding humanity. Not their ships. Not their weapons. Not their numbers. The foundation is this: they are always already moving. Whatever you have just realized about them, they have already accounted for it. Whatever response you are planning, they are already 3 steps past the moment that made it necessary. By the time you realize what they have done, they have already struck again. Plan accordingly. High Commander Sareth read the document from the first word to the last. Then he set it down on his desk. He looked out the window of his office at the Valorian capital city, at the towers and the lights and the centuries of empire that had always assumed, without really examining the assumption, that being old meant being permanent. He thought about a 23-year-old eating a cold sandwich. He thought for about 40 minutes. He thought about 12,000 people who had gone home safe. He thought about a 12-page agreement that could not be explained around. He thought about Maya Torres, wherever she was, looking at whatever stars she could see from her window. He did not know about Maya Torres specifically. He did not know her name or her age or what she had written in her journal. He did not know about Ohio, the open window, or the warm night. But he understood, in the deep and specific way that comes from reading analysis reports at 2 a.m. for a year, that there were 10,000 Maya Torreses out there. 100,000. 1,000,000. All of them are looking up. All of them were being taught the same thing, in different words, by the same civilization that had built the system he was reading about. Be first. Call it in. Don't wait. Sareth sat back in his chair. Caro, he said quietly to no one. Enough. We stop here. But even as he said it, he knew, with the tired, clear-eyed certainty of a man who has spent a year learning to read a pattern he had spent centuries missing, that for humanity, stopping was never really the point. They were already moving. They were already past this moment. They were already, in 1,000 small invisible ways, striking again. White medium star, the end, white medium star.